Once I know what type of document outline I'm trying to generate, it's a lot easier to begin planning the initial document structure. I found that by starting with the major sections of content and sort of creating those sections first, empty of any actual content, that usually I'm a lot more successful at keeping my content organized correctly. I want to build the initial structure of our Trails page by focusing on the main sections of content. As we build it, we're going to focus on those new semantic elements in HTML5 and how they can help define the relationship of our content to each other. So I've opened up the trails.htm in the 02_05 folder. And as you can see, this document looks a little different than the last time we saw it. I've got some HTML comments in there that let us know kind of what these main sections of content are and which order they're going to go in. So branding and navigation are going to be first. Then we're going to have our main review with comments. Below that, we're going to have our writer reviews and the Hi Trail facts. Add below that, and then the disclaimer and contact info. So just like we had in our document outline. So I want to start off by talking about the branding and navigation, which are going to be at the very top of the page. There's a lot of different semantic elements that we could use for this, but really header is probably the one that works the best. Headers contain introductory content. And if they're at the very top of the page, they're the introductory content for the entire page. And that sounds perfect for branding and navigation. So what I'm going to do is highlight that comment, and then I'm going to surround that with a header element. Now, this is not a brackets course, but for some of you using brackets, you're probably going, wait just a minute, how did you do that? Well, I added an extension to brackets called Surround that adds a hotkey that allows you to surround highlighted text with whatever element you choose. It's a great little extension, and I highly recommend going out and getting it if you are a brackets user. Okay, so we've got our header. That is where all of our main branding and page navigation are going to go inside of that. Now let's talk about what we want to do for our main review. Now, the thing that we have to remember here is that both the main review and the comments go together. So they need to be grouped together as a single entity. I'm going to highlight both of these comments. To do that, I can choose from any number of semantic elements, but really the two that make the most sense in terms of HTML5 are article and section. And these are elements that people get confused about in terms of when they're appropriate to use. Well, in a lot of cases, they're judgment calls. Now, I'm going to use an article here. So what I'm going to do, again, is I'm going to surround this in an article. And then as soon as I've done that, I want to discuss why. So articles essentially are standalone content. The best description I've heard of it is like an article of clothing, okay? So if it can stand on its own, meaning the content can be removed from the page and it is still understandable, it still represents itself, it could be syndicated, you could include it in an RSS feed, for example, and it would make sense for folks. Since this is a trail review and it's going to have comments and all that stuff, it does meet the criteria for an article. Now, a section element groups semantic content together. So you'll note that sections really don't say anything about content being able to stand on its own. That's not what they do. Sections are there to group themed content, meaning you're grouping a section of content and all that content relates to each other or goes with each other. Well, to me, that's perfect for a section of comments. The individual comments themselves might warrant an article tag, but as a semantic grouping, they warrant a section element. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight that comment that says comments go here, and I'm going to surround that in a section element. Now, if you don't feel like you properly understand the difference between sections and articles, don't sweat it. We're going to be talking about those two really throughout the entire title because that's a big distinction. The other thing I want to point out is that it really is a judgment call most of the time. There are times when you can say definitely don't use an article or definitely don't use a section, but they're rare. Most of the times you could make an argument versus one or the other. So I want to be very, very clear about really having rules for yourself about when you're going to use them. Here's the way I do it. And you may be different than me, but this is the way I do it. If the content can stand on its own, if it is something that I would send to an RSS feed for somebody to read without having any of the rest of the page there, then I use an article tag. If, on the other hand, that it's a section within an article or a thematic grouping, meaning all those elements belong sort of together, but they need to be within their own section in the document outline, that's when I use a section element. And the biggest thing here is that it doesn't really matter how you define when you're going to use one versus the other, as long as they're semantically correct. It's just that you need to be consistent. So if you use article a certain way, be consistent with how you use it. If you use section a certain way, be consistent with how you use it as well. Now let's go down a little bit. Writer reviews and OHI facts. So here we're going to have 2 writer reviews and an OHI facts article. So those are going to be 3 separate pieces of content that I want to group together semantically. So which tag should we use? If you guessed section, you're exactly right. You're beginning to pick up on this. All right. So I'm going to highlight that, and I'm going to surround that with a section tag as well. There we go. Now let's talk about our ad content. The ad content, you could make an argument for putting it in an article. It certainly could probably stand alone, but it doesn't rise to that level of importance. And I really doubt that you would want to syndicate the ad or anything like that. So, you could make the argument that it fits in an article, but there's another semantic element that it makes more sense to be in, and that would be the aside. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place this in an aside element, and let's talk about why this is the better choice. An aside element basically says that this content relates to its siblings, meaning the content on the same level, but that it's not really part of them. It's just related to them in some way or another. The fact that this is an ad and it doesn't really fit into the category of being a writer review or a comment or belonging to that content really at all. It's just saying that, hey, this is related to the page content. It's an ad for the company or an ad on the page, but it's not really part of that content. And that is what an aside does really, really well. So I'm going to use an aside there instead of an article. Now, finally, we have the disclaimer and contact info. It's going here down towards the bottom of the page. Contact info, copyright, or legal data, all that fits perfectly within one particular type of semantic element, and that would be the footer. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wrap all of that in a footer element. And we are going to take a little bit more time as the course goes on to examine these semantic elements in more detail and talk about when they're appropriate to use. So this is not the only time we're going to have this discussion. Okay, so we have a nice semantic basic page structure to work with. There still is a little bit more that we can do to enhance our basic page structure, so we're going to keep doing that in our next exercise as we define the page's main content.